Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this How to Better Influence and Motivate Your Team webinar. My name is Rob Austin-Goodall. My colleague Andy Webber will be delivering this. I'll be moderating it. Thank you for those who have turned up. For those who haven't heard the message over the last sort of 10-15 minutes or so, please utilise the chat function. For those of you who want to ask questions, please use that and we'll come to the questions at the end of the session. Or if you have a technical problem, please ask us in the chat box. If you haven't got access to the chat box, if you look on the right hand side of your screen, you'll see a tab with an arrow on it. Click onto that and click attendee chat or chat function, and that should appear and you should be able to type into it. And thank you for those who have already done that and introduced yourself. There's a number of you there. That's brilliant. And we'll crack on with this. So Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much. Thanks. Welcome to everybody. Welcome one and all. I'm just going to stop sharing the slides for a moment so you can see who you're dealing with. I'm Andy. I am an associate consultant with the institution. I've been working with the institution for about 21 years, one way or another, in various different formats, largely delivering leadership training and workshops, leadership training workshops, and also one-to-one coaching sessions. So mostly in the engineering sector, but sometimes outside of the engineering sector as well. So what I want to talk to you about today, as I said, as Rob said, is the idea of getting the best from your team, in essence. And in particular, what I want to think about is motivation. And so to do that, we are going to explore various motivation theories and some traditional and also some more recent thinking on this topic. So let me begin by just giving you a little bit of a background, a bit of introduction to this. It's going to be about 45 minutes or so of talking, and then some opportunities for questions at the end. So when we think about leadership, in essence, our role as a leader is to get results, whatever those results might be. And as a leader, we are tasked with getting results through others. By definition, that's what leadership is about. Leadership isn't only line management, of course. We can be leaders in all kinds of different contexts. We can take the lead in a situation. We might not necessarily be the formal leader, but if we're being asked to get results, we need to find some kind of balance between various things. And leadership is no small measure, in my opinion, about balancing competing priorities, balancing different things when different priorities occur. So in particular, at various times as a leader, we need to be focused on productivity, on achieving the objectives that we need to achieve. But as I said, we're achieving our objectives through others if we're leaders. So at the same time as achieving objectives, we need to focus on relationships and maintain a sense of well-being amongst the people that we are leading. Now, these two aren't necessarily contradictory. You can maintain the balance as you go. There are times when you might have to focus on the objectives at the expense, perhaps, of people's well-being, but we then need to redress the balance later. When we consider motivation, though, and we include motivation in the execution of tasks, then we can maintain the balance throughout. Not always possible, but often. And that's really what I want to consider today, is how do we do that? How do we achieve objectives and maintain the relationships and the well-being of people at the same time? Sort of like the what and the how. So what is motivation? Some of you may recognize this as being Eisenhower, and that's what he thought motivation was. I've got a couple of definitions for you here. It's about why we do things and having a reason for doing things, or it's about the desire that we have within ourselves to do things. So how do you get people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it? I'm going to look at some traditional theories, many of which you will be familiar with, I suspect. And first, most famous is Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. There are various different versions. This is the simplest version of it. If you haven't come across this before, in essence, he suggested that we all have needs, and we all have needs that need to be fulfilled in order. And at the base, we have physiological needs. These are the survival needs, if you like. We need air, food, water, those real basic fundamental needs that we need to continue our existence. Beyond that, we start to look, once we have those needs satisfied, he suggested, we start to look at trying to satisfy other sets of needs, safety needs. This is about security. It's about having a place to live and some security in the way in which we're living. Once we've satisfied those needs, we start to look for connections with others, affiliation needs. This is the social needs that we have as humans. And then we want to feel good about ourselves. We have needs to feel like we matter, like we are important. And then at the top of his hierarchy are these self-actualization needs. These are needs around development, about growth, about learning. If you have seen this before, there's a decent chance you've seen it in a social media context with the joke that there's an even more fundamental set of needs underneath physiological needs, which is Wi-Fi. Herzberg had a very similar idea about the way in which needs are satisfied, but a slightly different way of looking at it. He looked at there being sort of two sets of needs, or factors, as he called them: hygiene factors, or dissatisfiers, and motivators. So the hygiene factors, or dissatisfiers, don't really motivate as much as demotivate if we don't have them. So these are the basic things that we need to be in place before we can start to use the motivating factors to actually motivate people. He suggested that actually if one of these things is missing, then it's no use worrying about the motivators, which motivate, because they won't work until those fundamental things are in place. So I've got a poll for you now to have a look at, and I want to just give you a chance to have a look at what some of these ideas, some of these factors, and I want you to try to decide which ones are hygiene factors. So in the list on the poll, just click all of the factors that you think are hygiene factors.
Kirsty, do you want to run the poll?
Or we could just press on. Looks like we might have some issues with the poll functionality. So Okay, let's press on. So there are these two sets of factors, and you can see from this slide, hopefully, that the two sets of factors. Some of them are a little bit surprising, I think. Things that we tend to associate with being motivators, according to Herzberg at least, are perhaps things that really aren't motivators as much as dissatisfiers if we're lacking them. In particular, salary and benefits. So financial rewards, in some sets of circumstances at least, don't operate in the way that we might imagine them to operate. Now, they can operate on the motivator side because there are sort of a physical recognition of work that we're doing, but not always. So another theory I want to share with you is this X and Y theory of McGregor. He talked about managers, and he did some research, and he looked at managers, and he looked at the way that managers thought about people. And he had two theories. Theory X managers, which is really attitude X managers. These managers had some sort of fundamental beliefs about the way in which they saw people reporting to them. And as we know, your attitude drives your behavior. So considering people in a certain way drives certain behaviors in terms of their management style. And Theory X managers tended to see people as being fundamentally lazy. They're not really wanting to be there. They're only there because they have to be. And the best way to manage them is to hit them with a stick or tempt them with a carrot. Theory Y managers have a different attitude towards people. They see people as being much more interested in being at work. They're people that want to take part in things. They seek responsibility. They respond best when they're given freedom to make decisions and involve themselves in the work in which they're doing. Now, the reality is that no one person is either one or the other. We tend to be a bit of a mix, but if you imagine it as a spectrum, understanding where you sit on the spectrum and what drives your management behaviors can help you to understand a little bit about perhaps things that you could do differently. The observations of McGregor were that in general, what tended to happen is this tended to be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Theory X managers tended to end up with Theory X people. Theory Y managers tended to end up with Theory Y people. Now, that's not to say that Theory X managers are unsuccessful. You know, some people are very good at managing this way, but they found that people tended to respond to the way in which they were managed and turn into the beliefs of their manager. So, moving on to some more recent ideas about motivation and how motivators operate in the modern world. And it's not to suggest that what we've just been discussing is no longer correct. Take Maslow, though, for example, looking all the way back to those basic needs of air, water, food. The reality of the modern world is that in work, we're not really struggling to satisfy those sets of needs anymore. When we were living in caves and fighting off saber-toothed tigers, things were different, and those needs were very relevant to us. It's not that they're not true now, it's just that they're not particularly relevant. So we can almost ignore those more basic needs. Anne Pink has written a book called Drive and gave a TED Talk, which you can see a link to on the slide there. TED Talk's called The Puzzle of Motivation. And he's exploring the way in which we motivate in the modern world. And in particular, the way that our organizations are set up to motivate people in the modern world. And he looked at, it simplifies things by sorting the tasks that we do into two sets. He looks at mechanistic tasks where there are very clear rules, there's a single solution to the problem, it's a routine type thing. Extrinsic motivators, that is to say, motivators from the outside, extrinsic motivators, work in this instance where we say, well, if you can do this, then I'll give you this. It gives us that goal focus, helps us to narrow our focus onto the goal and drive towards the target. And in 20th century kinds of roles, he suggests, that worked really well. Because when we were all sitting on production lines producing something, there wasn't that much more to work than just achieving the tasks. And the incentives and rewards that we were offered and given and received worked pretty much as you'd expect. That is to say, the more reward you offer, the better the productivity. And he looked at more complex tasks. And what he means by more complex tasks are tasks where the rules are not so clear, where there are a whole range of different possible solutions. And, maybe there isn't even a solution that exists. These tasks are ambiguous and they're interesting. They contain their own motivation. We do them. Think about things that you do at work, which you just get lost in. You get engaged with, you get enthusiastic about, and you're working at it, and you look at the clock and it's time to go home, and it feels like only 10 minutes has passed since you started. These are the kinds of tasks that we in the 21st century have more and more and more of in our roles. And it's important to recognize that these tasks require time to think about. We need to come up with new solutions to these complex problems. And when we incentivize and reward as we once did, those incentives and rewards don't work as they used to. In fact, in the TED Talk, Dan Pink talks about all kinds of examples and research where these rewards, it's not just that they don't work, they don't improve performance, they often actually harm performance. How can that be? It's quite counterintuitive. And the simple explanation is that if we need to be creative, we need to stop and think, and the effect of a reward is to narrow our focus and drive towards the goal. So we go rushing off headlong towards this goal, which turns out not to be the right thing. So in some instances, with some tasks, and of course the reality of the modern world, we're not 100% complex. Our roles are all a mixture of both mechanistic and complex tasks. But where we're working with complex tasks, Pink suggests we need a new way of looking at it. And crucially, a bit like Herzberg, his view of money is that it's on the dissatisfier side. If you're not paying people fairly, and people perceive that they're not being paid fairly for their work, then that's going to get in the way. You need to get the issue of money off the table, as he says. And once you've done that, once people feel like they're fairly rewarded, we need a different set of motivators in the modern world. He talks about these three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy being the ability to control our own destiny. We want to feel like we're in control of things. Mastery, I don't think I have to sell to a group of engineers. This is the drive that we have to improve and to extend our knowledge and become more expert. Purpose is about understanding why we're doing stuff. If I'm doing a task in isolation with no idea about what's going on around me and I don't really know what happens at the end of it, that's a very different situation to understanding that if I do my thing and Rob, my teammate, he does his thing, and Kirsty, she does her thing, and together we put them together, and then the team creates this beautiful pink fluffy thing, and that goes forward to the rest of the department, and there's a higher purpose to what I'm doing, that in itself provides significant motivation to people. Dan Ariely has some very similar ideas about motivation, and I'm going to, in a second, combine these two and look at some things that we can do to execute on some of their ideas. His TED Talk, that I'm going to play you a couple of extracts, short extracts from in just a second, is called What Makes Us Feel Good About Our Work. And he, as I said, he's got some very similar ideas to Dan Pink. So let me just play you a little clip. This is the very start of the talk.
I want to talk a little bit today about labor and work. When we think about how people work, the naive intuition we have is that people are like rats in a maze, that all people care about is money. And the moment we give people money, we can direct them to work one way, we can direct them to work another way. This is why we give bonuses to bankers and pay in all kinds of ways. And we really have this incredibly simplistic view of why people work and what the labor market looks like. At the same time, if you think about it, there's all kinds of strange behaviors in the world around us. Think about something like mountaineering and mountain climbing. If you read books of people who climb mountains, difficult mountains, do you think that those books are full of moments of joy and happiness? No, they're full of misery. In fact, it's all about frostbites and difficulty to walk and difficulty of breathing, cold, challenging circumstances. And if people were just trying to be happy, the moment they would get to the top, they would say, this was a terrible mistake, I'll never do it again. Instead, let me sit on a beach somewhere drinking mojitos. But instead, people go down, and after they recover, they go up again. And if you think about mountain climbing as an example, it suggests all kinds of things. It suggests that we care about reaching the end, a peak. It suggests that we care about the fight, about the challenge. It suggests that there's all kinds of other things that motivate us to work or behave in all kinds of ways.
So, lots of similar ideas there to what I was explaining about what Dan Pink says. In particular, this idea that we have this rather simplistic view of what motivates people. We tend to think about money and money alone. Now, neither Dan, I don't know why it is that everyone's called Dan, but neither of them would suggest that money is not important. But of course, most people go to work to earn money. It's a kind of necessary evil in the modern world, if you like. But there's way more to motivation than simply money. So I just want to give you another example from his TED Talk about the sorts of things that motivate us in his opinion.
The next part, I want to show you something about the positive motivation. So there is a store in the US called the IKEA. And IKEA is a store with kind of okay furniture that takes a long time to assemble. And I don't know about you, but every time I assemble one of those, it takes me much longer. It's much more effortful. It's much more confusing. I put things in the wrong way. I can't say I enjoy those pieces. I can't say I enjoy the process. But when I finish it, I seem to like those IKEA pieces of furniture more than I like other ones. And there's an old story about cake mixers. So when they started cake mixers in the 40s, they would take this powder and they would put it in a box and they would ask housewives to basically pour it in, stir some water in it, mix it, put it in the oven, and voila, you had cake. But it turns out they were very unpopular. People did not want them. And they thought about all kinds of reasons for that. Maybe the taste was not good. No, the taste was great. What they figured out was that there was not enough effort involved. It was so easy that nobody could serve cake to their guest and say, here is my cake. No, it was somebody else's cake. It's as if you bought it in a store. It didn't really feel like your own. So what did they do? They took the eggs and the milk out of the powder. Now, You had to break the eggs and add them. You had to measure the milk and add it, mixing it. Now it was your cake. Now everything was fine.
Okay, interesting story, and interesting about what it is that motivates us. Seemingly an easier task, this cake mix where you just added water, compared to the cake mix which you had to work a bit harder with. Again, it goes back to what he was saying about mountaineers and the challenge and some kind of effort that we need to input into a task to make it satisfying to achieve the end goal. And so these are some things he talks about in the talk. Talks about the importance of that challenge as long as you reach the end. Talks about the importance of meaning, which is very similar to Dan Pink's ideas about purpose. Talks about acknowledgement, which I'm not really going to dig into today, but there's a really interesting small part that he does where he illustrates, using one of the studies that he's undertaken, how actually you can almost crush motivation simply by failing to forget to acknowledge people's effort. The flip side of that seemingly very bad news is that actually only the tiniest acknowledgement can actually really add to people's motivation. Last thing is ownership. We need to feel like we own things. And again, that's obviously pretty similar to the idea of autonomy. So what? So what? All these great ideas about motivation, how do we actually apply them? And I want to think about this from two perspectives. Largely today is about motivating your team, but I also want to be a little bit selfish about this. I also want to consider how we might apply some of these ideas to self-motivation, because that's pretty important. If we're going to get the best from a team, we need to get the best from ourselves as well. So autonomy and ownership. When we think about autonomy in others, when we think about how can we give people autonomy if we're leading them, it's very largely about the way in which we delegate. So when we delegate, do we cut up the bigger task into small pieces and drip feed those tasks? Why would we do that? Probably because we like to retain control. But that's not motivating for the person taking on those smaller tasks. Much more motivating to be given responsibility and authority for a larger chunk, being accountable for something that's now mine. I can do it. I can decide. I can complete this thing and have some pride in it when I return it back to the person who's delegated to me. Crucially, though, that word authority, when we delegate in this way, first of all, we have to let go of our fear of loss of control. And secondly, we have to give people authority to make decisions. If you give them the big piece and they constantly have to come back to you to say, well, can I do this? And is this okay? That doesn't work either. It's giving them accountability. It's giving them the whole task, and it's giving them the authority to make decisions within that whole task. And what does that do? It gives people a feeling of being in control. So when we think about ourself and autonomy, what does that mean? Clearly, it's not about the delegation when we're giving ourselves autonomy. How do you give yourself autonomy? It's more about that feeling of being in control. And there are a couple of things that you can do. Most simplistically, look at your organization, look at your time management. The better organized you are and the better you manage your time, the more you will feel in control of things. It's about this idea of being reactive versus proactive. If you're disorganized and you're constantly just having to react to the next thing that's coming along, you end up feeling a little bit out of control, a bit of a victim of circumstances, a victim of events that are happening around you. So managing your time better, being more organized, taking control of things is a good first step. This idea of being proactive, just want to explore that a little bit by considering somebody called Stephen Covey's first habit. I'm guessing many of you will have come across the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And his habit 1 in this book is to be proactive. And one of the things that he uses to explain this in the book, it has become known as Covey's circles. So Covey's circles explain the way that we see things and the way that we see ourselves in things. If you can imagine, the slide represents, and this is obviously massively not to scale, but the slide represents everything that's happening in the world. So that white space around the green circle is every single event that's occurring in the world. Somewhere in the top right corner, someone in Brazil just had a baby. Somewhere bottom left corner, someone in Moldova just had a car crash. All of these things that never enter our consciousness. We never become aware of them. A certain subset of events, and not just individual small events like the ones I just described, but ongoing events, we become aware of. They become part of our circle of concern. So, for example, slightly more ongoing thing that is definitely within my circle of concern is the environment and global warming. That's something that I get really concerned about and worried about. And it bothers me. I think we should be doing more. And I wonder what the future will hold for my kids. So, and this is the problem with the circle of concern, is that with something like the environment, it's so big. I can't do that much to change this. And I feel, again, completely out of control if I'm not careful. So what Covey says is, well, yeah, that's true. Unfortunately, Andy, you cannot change this on your own, but there are things you can do. And so when you find yourself worrying about anything, ask yourself, what do I control? What can I do? So for me, it's I recycle. I made a compost heap in my garden. I work hard to reduce the amount that I use my car, etc., etc., etc. So there are things that I can do. Clearly, the tiniest drop in the most massive ocean, but now I'm doing something. I feel a little bit less out of control. I can extend that. I can think about how I can influence others to think about the same things I do. So the way I bring up my kids, the fact that I talk about these things on webinars. There's all sorts of other ways in which I can perhaps make some kind of impact on this thing that I'm worried about. I can also extend my circle of influence if I want to. Think about, I don't know, maybe resigning from my role and getting elected to be a member of parliament. God forbid. But there's various things that we can do to influence to affect our circle of influence. Just a few thoughts, considerations about how you might use this to start to be a little bit more proactive in your own life and start to regain a little bit of control. I want to move on, though, to think about, oh no, I don't. I want to talk about the Serenity Prayer. I forgot I threw this in at the last minute. I really like the Serenity Prayer. I'm not sure if you've come across it before. It's not, for me, it's not a particularly religious thing. I just like the sentiment here. And this idea that we, and fundamentally, this is what the circles are about as well. It's the fact that we, first of all, need to be able to realize that we don't have control over everything. And the things that we don't have control of, we just got to let go. This is a fundamental idea in sports psychology. If you're interested in sport, you'll often hear sports managers in particular talking about controlling the controllables. it's recognizing that, and it is then that last part about understanding the difference between the things that I can change and the things that I can't. Now I want to talk about mastery. So mastery, I think, is a bit more simple. It's a bit easier to understand, and we can use the same model for both yourself and others. And this is about the extent to which we push ourselves. I'm sure you've heard talk of comfort zones in the past. Comfort zone is a nice, comfortable place to be. We understand what's going on there. There's routine there. There's stuff that we're used to. There's all the things that we can already do. And that's a great place to be sometimes. It's certainly a place that we need to be at times, but not all the time. If we never step out of our comfort zone, things start to get a bit stale and boring and mundane. So time to time, we need to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone, stretch ourselves a little bit, learn something new, try something different, take a risk. God forbid, make a mistake. And this also applies to people that we're leading. We need to look at the people around us, and in order to support them and their growth, we need to encourage them to stretch themselves a little bit from time to time, whilst also recognizing that we can take it too far with ourselves and we can push others too hard at the same time. Purpose. I just want to share, before I talk about how to apply this, some interesting research that was done by Harvard Business Review on this. And this was they talked to senior executives in various organizations about their perspective on purpose and how important did they think it was in terms of motivation. And they recognized it being very important in theory, but in reality, they didn't feel like their organizations were doing a great job. In essence, they are agreeing with what Dan Pink and Dan Ariely both suggest, that whilst we know this stuff, we're not really doing it, which is strange if you think about it. We understand the research, we understand the concepts, but our organizations are not set up to do these things. Nonetheless, we're not really talking about us leading organizations, we're talking about leading teams. And so how do we think about purpose and meaning in the context of working with our teams? Think about line of sight. Line of sight is about connecting up the dots for people. It's about helping them to understand their place in something bigger. That could be the team, it could be their department, the organization. It could also be their career. So this task that I'm doing, it's an important task because, as I was saying earlier, when Rob and Kirsty do their tasks together, we produce this great thing together. And not only that, as we produce this in the L&D department, the events team in the IMechE is also doing something, and we put those two things together, and we come up with something even bigger. And there's organizational success. And if I genuinely feel part of that, that's an incredibly motivating thing for me. There's I'm not sure if it's a apocryphal story, but there was a story about JFK walking around NASA, and he bumped into a janitor who was mopping the floor, and said to the janitor, "So, what's happened here? What are you doing?" And the janitor looked around, looked up in the sky, and he said, "I'm putting a man on the moon." I don't know if it's true, but it's a beautiful idea that everybody in NASA felt like they were contributing to the same big picture goal. Sure, many of you come across SMART objectives, and I'm sure most of you don't set them because in my experience, we're pretty rubbish when it comes to setting SMART objectives. Again, it's one of those things we understand, but it's not something that we apply. And when you think about it, if you look through that list, which of those is it okay to miss out? Is it okay to have an objective that isn't time bound or non-measurable or non-specific or not achieved? When you think about it from the negative perspective, it's pretty clear that they've got to be all of those for them to be of any use whatsoever. In relation to purpose and meaning, it's the relevance. It's about making your objective relevant to something else, either the rest of the team or the department or perhaps someone's career. Another thing you might want to consider in relation to this, which I don't really have time to talk about today, is a whole idea of purpose-driven leadership, which is drawing on many of the ideas that I've just been discussing, but it sort of packages it up in a whole separate theory. In terms of your own purpose and meaning, I just want to mention something called Ikigai. My colleagues will tell you if you ask them that I bang on about Japan, probably rather too much. I'm a Japanophile, if that's the right word. I love Japan and I love everything Japanese. And my daughter some years ago bought me this book, which you can see is well used. I dropped it on the bottom right-hand corner. It's about, again, as you can see, that the Japanese secret to a long and happy life. And it's the way in which we connect up different parts of our lives together. Start with the bits around the outside. Think about what you love to do. Oh, I love to play golf. Think about what I'm good at. Sadly, I'm not good at golf, but I'm all right. What can I be paid for? I definitely can't be paid for playing golf. So golf is a passion for me. It's what I love and I'm reasonable at. But it doesn't really help me with my Ikigai. It doesn't really help me with my core purpose. So what else do I love? Well, I love meeting people. I love working with people. I love particularly traveling and working in different cultures. What am I good at? Well, I'm pretty good at meeting people as well, actually. I'm good at building relationships. I'm good at working with people. What else am I interested in? Well, I'm interested in psychology. I'm interested in the way people work. What could I be paid for? Well, maybe leadership. So you can see how happily, and this is a retrospective fit for me, I didn't think this through and then pick a career. I found myself in my career and very happy in it. And this explains to me why I'm so happy in my career. So getting your own life in order and giving it purpose and meaning. Challenge and reaching the end, I think, is pretty simple. And it relates very closely to setting the right objectives that are both realistic and achievable on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, they need to be somewhat stretching. They're too easy, if they're too achievable and realistic, then they're not really that exciting. There's no joy at achieving it in the end. The personalization section, when I was putting this together, I hesitated because it's just a couple of slides and a couple of minutes, which implies, if I put it on just one slide, that it's not important. It's fundamental. We're not going to talk about it that much, but it's so important that you personalize this. What we've done so far is talk about theories in a very macro way. The reality is, and we know this, one size does not fit all. By the way, I don't know if you get this, but that picture on that slide was driving me nuts yesterday. There's a bit of an optical illusion that it's not straight. I can assure you it is. I did it with the ruler and everything. It just looks like it's skewed. Annoying me, my OCD. So we're all different. You didn't need to come on a webinar to know that we're all different. What we need to do when we're motivating people is understand them and get to understand what really motivates them in order to adapt our approach. So, what's stretching for one person is not stretching for another. What one person is interested in mastering is not the same for another. So we need to think about these ideas, but we also need to think about how they apply to individuals. Just one thought on that before we wrap up. This guy, David McClelland, developed something called the acquired needs theory. It's also called the learned needs theory. And it was about 3 sets of needs that he identified in association with motivation. McGregor stands for achievement, affiliation, and power. And he noted that we all have these 3 sets of needs, but it's one of those things that he was starting to recognize is different for each of us. One of those, or sometimes 2, take priority for me and other ones for you. And so it's a way in which we can start to think about how we individualize some of these theories. Allow me to summarize, if I may. We've looked at some theories, old and new. We've looked at some tools for applying some of the ideas from those theories. At the top level, when you look at those theories, there's a lot of commonality between them. There's a lot of red threads running through them. The idea that we need, going all the way back to Maslow and this idea of self-actualization, it's about growth and mastery and learning and stretching ourselves. There's also a very common theme there where there's some kind of order to the way in which needs need to be met. There's a hierarchy of some kind. And also, probably most controversially for most of you, this idea that financial rewards don't necessarily work in the way that we think they do. For me, financial rewards are often lazy motivation. And the reality of this as well is, just ask you to consider, if you have a team, or if you don't have a team, still, what's your budget for financially rewarding people? Probably around zero. So I'd say you better hope these people are right and that its financial rewards are less important than we think. And we can use some of these other ideas. We can think about how we can give people purpose and meaning to their work, how we can help them to grow, how we can give them more control and ownership of the tasks that they do, how we can generate that feeling of joy when you achieve something. And we haven't talked about it so much in this session, but the importance of making sure that we're connected to others and affiliation needs, according to McClelland. To do that, simply, we looked at setting objectives and thinking about how we set SMART objectives and link those different elements of SMART to the different pieces. We talked about the importance of delegating and how we delegate. Do we delegate to the person that can already do it? Or perhaps today we should delegate to someone that it would be a stretching task for? Do we push people out of their stretch zone and ourselves? Can we gain more autonomy and control in our own lives by thinking about Covey's circle? I'd like to thank you very much for listening. I hope it's been of interest to you. I hope you've got some thoughts and ideas that you might be able to apply. And if anyone's got any questions, then please feel free to ask. I think Rob's going to manage that process.
Hello. Yes, sorry about that, Andy. I couldn't find out how to turn my microphone back on for some reason. Right. Yes, we have a number of questions. Let's see. First one here. It's quite a long one, so pay attention. I find it difficult when I have line reports and I don't have control over their salaries paid or bonuses. Also, I have team members who are developing, but there isn't always a job role progression for them unless I move on. And they only see a job title name status as a sign of development progression. I've tried to highlight the progression development should be based on skills and attributes rather than job title, i.e. he may be an engineer and not yet a team leader, but still develop and learn and apply around team leader type skills outside his normal role. I've given more autonomy and delegated work, but still they see it that they are not being able to progress, develop until they get a raise or title change. Sometimes they're even reluctant to take on additional development tasks, i.e. opportunities to develop, when they're not getting any additional benefits or rewards. I can't win. So how do you motivate team members who are only motivated by money or job title, i.e. moving from engineer to senior? Or do you motivate them how do you motivate them when I cannot change salaries or job titles for them?
Could you repeat the question? Okay.
No.
Blimey, that was a long one. to the point where I got a little bit confused partway through. I think in essence, though, well, I'm hoping a lot of what we've talked about today addresses some of those things. I guess the ideas that we've discussed today really are all outside of financial rewards. And if you don't have control over the financial rewards, then that's something, that's very common. Even if you do have control, if you are a line manager, you can't always find a budget for providing people with reward. So the ideas that we've discussed look beyond that idea. I guess the potential fundamental issue here is that, in Dan Pink's words, if the issue of money is not off the table, if the people in your team don't perceive that they're fairly rewarded, again, like Herzberg and the dissatisfiers and motivators, it's going to be difficult for you to motivate them beyond that initial issue. Once you've got that issue off the table, then I think all of the ideas, or some of the ideas, will work. Again, it's about working with the individual to try to understand what particularly would motivate them. Just the other caveat to that statement about fairly rewarded, the other thing that can affect that is if we're in a stage in life where we're fighting to sort of, I don't know, for example, get on the property ladder. That fact that we need more money in order to do that, in order to achieve something which you could argue would in the Maslow hierarchy would be a safety need, but that can almost override the fairness. So I might think I'm fairly rewarded, but I might still not have enough money to do something, and that might drive me towards needing more money to achieve it. So again, it's not that money's not important. If you don't have access to money, all I can suggest is that you try some of the other things. A fairly long-winded answer to a fairly long-winded question.
Yes, it was a very long question. Do you feel that there is a blend between X and Y types, going back to some of the stuff you talked about earlier on?
Yeah, my instinct with that is that I want in the modern world to work more on theory Y. As I said at the time, I fundamentally believe people live up to or down to your expectations in the end. So if you treat people in a way that, in a theory Y way, you give them responsibility, you treat them as if they care, that they will eventually live up to that, even if initially they don't operate that way. That said, you do need controls. You do need to monitor performance. You do need to set and reward achievement of targets. So some of the theory X stuff also works. Any more for any more?
Sorry, Andy. I took my microphone. It might help. Carrying on from that, or do the situations define our attitudes?
They certainly affect. I think fundamentally we have a tendency to have a set of beliefs within us, but we also are wise enough to respond to the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So definitely a factor, yes.
Excellent. Right. I have a statement rather than a question. Maslow, and I'm assuming that is, who is Maslow?
Maslow. Abraham Maslow, he was a psychologist looking at these ideas in the early part of the 20th century.
Excellent. Any tips for maintaining motivation in an environment where priorities, goals are ever shifting, with requirement to deal with emerging issues constantly?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I think it depends on the role of the person asking that question. I'm going to make a rather grand assumption that you're a line manager responsible for a team, and they keep changing the priorities and shifting the goalposts. The answer is you take the hit, at least conceptually, as far as you can. Take the hit. You act as a kind of buffer between those constantly shifting goalposts as far as you can. On the other hand, of course, it's no good just continuing blindly on a course that you've set when it's no longer relevant. So try and set objectives and define purposes for your team that, in the best of your ability, are going to be non-changing. And in particular, if what you're tasked with is unclear or perhaps even non-existent, then set objectives for your team anyway. Give them a purpose and talk about, as far as you can, defining a purpose that they are contributing towards.
Excellent, Andy. Next one. Did you say that you don't think SMART objectives work?
No, I said I think SMART objectives are fundamentally important, and I think that we're not very good at setting them. I.e., we set objectives that, generally speaking, are not that smart. And what I was trying, perhaps the bit that I confused you with, was that when you think about SMART and specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, realistic, time bound, if you flip it around, because people are fairly blasé, I think, about SMART objectives. Which one of those 5 or 6, if you have 2 R's, is it okay for the objective not to be? Is it okay for an objective not to be achievable? Well, obviously not. It's pointless as an objective. Is it okay if it's not realistic? Clearly not. It's got to be realistic, otherwise it's absolutely pointless. If it's not time bound, well, there's no measure for whether it's achieved or not. It's ongoing. If it's not measurable, then we can't define whether it's been achieved. If it's not specific, then it's probably not measurable either. So no, the answer is, if I've given that impression, I retract it. They're very important. It's very important to have SMART objectives, and an objective that is not SMART is not useful. It's a bit black and white, but I'll stick with it.
Excellent. Which technique would you say is best for motivating people that you need to work with but are not your team and have operational pressure coming first?
Well, in that situation, very clearly, financial rewards are probably not within your remit. So again, I'll look at a version of any of the above. The simple way to remember them it is Dan Pink's ideas about AMP, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. They can really work. I would say fundamentally it's purpose. If you can give someone a reason and meaning to what they're doing, meaning in Dan Ariely's words, then, and connect that up for the person, then that will motivate them to want to contribute, even although you're not, directly responsible. Often happens in a matrix, project teams, and so
on. Next one we've got here. Can you give a 2-minute tip, something I could try next week with my team?
Interesting question. It's quite hard to answer that without any context. I would say line of sight. Go with line of sight. Have a team meeting. Get the team to contribute to the line of sight. What is our purpose as a team? We all have these tasks that we're doing, but do we have something that we're working towards, like a team? I hesitate to use the word vision because it's a little bit marketing-y these days, but some kind of overall purpose that the team is trying to achieve. What are we here for? Why do we do what we do? And then try and connect up what we're doing day to day to that greater purpose, so that we feel like we're making progress towards something bigger. That would be my first thing.
Excellent, Andy. Time for one or two more. Do you think that different cultures require different encouragement? Some cultures require encouragement more often than others. I've had this problem working in multi-country, regional, multicultural organizations.
Yeah, it's a bit like personalizing motivation to the individual. You also have to operate within the expectations, and I think that's the important thing with culture for me and leadership. People have different expectations from what leaders do or don't do. So it is absolutely shrink to fit. One of the things that would change, for example, would be the way in which feedback operates. And you don't only have to look at international culture as well. You can also look at generational culture. Generations operate differently and have different influences on them as we're growing up, and have different ways of thinking. And in fact, I believe there's some work that we're doing coming up in a few days that we'll show you in a slide in a sec to explore that. So yes is the short answer. It operates very differently in different contexts, and even different organizational cultures will have different patterns of behavior associated with them and different expectations as a consequence.
Cheers, Andy. One last one. We'll squeeze this in. How do you find out what someone's motivations are using virtual team, Zoom, etc., where we've obviously got the situation at the moment where you're not face to face with people?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's more difficult. Everything is slightly more complicated working virtually as compared to working face to face. You're lacking some of the communication that we get face to face, and in particular, what you're tending to lack is informal communication. You know, if you're working together in an office, in a team, you wander past each other's desk and ask how the weekend went, and then you bump into each other at the coffee machine and you talk about the football or whatever it is that we're doing. And that's often missing. So my sort of macro solution for that would be to try and find ways of reintroducing informal communication in a virtual environment. Play games, meet for coffee, do something that isn't work, but virtually. When it comes to one-to-one, again, the concept is exactly the same. It's just that the process is slightly more complex because you don't have the same connection when you're working virtually. But it's getting to know people, it's ask them questions, it's talk to them about what they found interesting in the past. But it's trying to see things from their perspective, ask them questions and listen.
Excellent. Cheers, Andy. Thank you, everyone, for attending that, and some excellent questions there. It's just gone past, so we'll call it quits. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Rob. Just going to share with you, if I can,